Okay, so we're going to talk about biodiversity for A-level biology. There are two important definitions to know. Firstly, biodiversity it can relate to a range of habitats, from a small local habitat to the Earth. It's quite a vague definition, and if you look online there are all sorts of different definitions for biodiversity. One definition that you definitely need to know and be quite precise about, though, is species richness. This is simply the number of different species in a community. And a community being the total of the different populations in a habitat, or it could even be the interactions between different organisms and different populations within a habitat. So here we've got two different communities. We've got a community in a meadow habitat, and we've got a community within could be a wheat field. So within this community here, we've got 5 different species. You've got a species richness of 5. You've got a population, a reasonable population of each of those species within that community. If you look at community B, which the farmer wants it to be a monocrop, so just one species, which is then going to be harvested and sold for food. The vast majority of it is just species 4, which could be wheat or barley or some other cereal crop. And then the others might just represent some plants that the farmer doesn't want to be in the field, so they might consider to be a weed. So both got the same species richness of 5 different species, but which is the most diverse? And that's what we're going to look at today with the index of biodiversity. So the species diversity index, you need to know what it means, and you need to know what measurements would need to be taken to be able to calculate it. So it's a measure of the number of different species, but not just that, which is species richness. It also includes the number of individuals within each species as well. So the higher the species diversity index, the more variety there is in the community, and also the more stable that ecosystem is against environmental change. So you need to know, and you could be asked a question on this, about what measurements you would need to take to be able to work out species diversity. So you've got the number of different species you need to calculate, i.e. the species richness, but also the number of individuals of each within each of those species. And you could be asked for why this is a better indicator of variation rather than just species richness. Because it takes into account any species that occur in small numbers. And if you think back to the previous example, both have the same species richness, but the one with more of each species would actually have a higher index of diversity. So how do you work out the species diversity index? And it's this formula here which you need to learn. Often they will provide it for you in the exam, but just in case they don't, you need to know how to do that. So first of all, D is representing the species diversity index. N is the total population of all species. It's a big N, sorry. Sign here is the sum of, and the little letter, little n, is the total population of each species. So we're going to work through an example. So here we've got different species of insect that were sampled. And the species richness here is 5. And not 6, so they could start off a question is what the species richness. Some people would then go straight into calculating the index of diversity without actually thinking, and the species richness is simply a number of different species. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different species. Even though this is written in here, it has 0, so that's not included. So that's another thing they could use to trip you up. So using this data, let's calculate the species index of diversity index. So the first thing you can do is you can recognise that each of these little numbers is representing little n. So the population of each of those species in that habitat. So something I would recommend you do in the exam is add an extra column to your table. And this allows you to calculate the little n times by little n minus 1. So the number, the population of each species times by the population of each species minus 1. And you can see here, so 563, the population of the beech aphid, times 562, and it equals those numbers. And you do that for each of those. And look at what we've got here. It's actually the sum of little n times by little n minus 1. So you just add up that column. In this case, it comes to 318,250. So we've got the first part of the equation, which is what goes underneath the divide. We then need the top, big N times by big N minus 1. And very straightforward to get big N, which is the total population of all species, you add up this column. So you add up all the little n's together, in which case it's 640. So put those bits together in the equation. So big N times by big N minus 1, so that's 640 times by 639, divided by what we put in this column here, 318,250, and D comes out to be, the index of diversity comes out to be 1.29. You can do a little error check. If your number is somewhere between 0 and 10, usually 5 or less, then you're probably on the right lines. Remember, the higher the number, the more variation of different species there is in their habitat, and the more able that habitat is to survive environmental change. They could make that technique slightly more difficult if they give you two sets of numbers for two different habitats, but all I would do is add an extra column if you can fit it in, or draw the extra column in the space you're given for your calculation. Another thing that they might do to try and trip you up is actually give you big N already, which is here, the total population, the total of all the populations added together. And what people might do is just use the formula and actually do 640 times by 639, thinking that this is a little n, but it's not. They've already given you big N. They've already totaled that column. So beware of that as well. In questions, though, it often comes down to these factors that are here. So what does a high species index of diversity actually mean? Well, especially so in a natural habitat here, it indicates you've got many plant species, and there's a high variety of different plant species will provide many different varieties of food sources. So there might be different types of berry, different types of leaves that different species could feed on, different insects can feed on, and it's also going to provide many different niches if they've got more plant species. So you've got more nesting sites, for example, and there's more different habitats as well. Also think about a food chain. If you've got more plant species and you've got more variety of food sources, for example, that can support a greater variety of insects, and that could then support a greater variety of birds, because there'd be a greater variety of insects for them to feed on. So modern farming, some could argue, is essential to be able to feed the large population. You've got a monocrop in a field, so one species of crop. Some key things to think about usually come up in A-level biology. So you're removing hedgerows. Insecticides are used to kill pests, and herbicides are used to kill weeds to prevent competition. So all of those things will lower the plant diversity. Think back to the three things we talked about before, how that could affect the index of diversity, why you've got a lower diversity. So there's less variety of food sources, fewer niches, and less habitats. So a lot of conservation is involved around trying to maintain diversity of habitats, and working alongside food production. Is there a way that this can be done which isn't going to affect food production too much? So things that a farmer could do is could plant hedges instead of using fences. So those hedges, as you can see in the picture here, would provide extra habitats, more variety of food sources. There's also potential to create new wetlands, reducing the use of pesticides by using biological control. You could have conservation areas at the edges of fields, so you could have a band around the edge of the field where you've got wildflowers, or creating protected areas. So a question you could get asked is, for example, hedges. What's the advantage to a farmer, and what are the disadvantages to a farmer about planting hedges? And in terms of an exam question, you need to think in terms of economy, so what are the costs, is there a cost benefit, and also the yields. Is it going to change the yield, so the amount of crops that you could harvest? So if you have hedges, you might have more variety of habitats, food sources. You might then be able to support a greater variety of pollinators, so which means that more crops could get pollinated, it could increase the yield. For example, a possible disadvantage to a farmer might be the cost of installing the hedges, the initial cost, the initial outlay. It might also make it more difficult and time consuming to harvest all of the field. You might have to turn the tractor around more often, for example. There are many others, I'm sure you can think of more. And here are some other examples that have come up in questions or are important for you to be aware about or think about. The effect of human activity on species diversity.